opportunity this evening to talk about our common coastal challenge. My name is Matthew Sanders. I'm with the state's Office of Community Development. We'll talk a little bit more about what I do for the state here in a little bit. Before we get started tonight, just a couple of things. You'll notice there's some photographers walking around tonight documenting our festivities today. We're also live streaming this event on Facebook Live. If you do not want to be photographed, if you do not want to be captured in that videography, certainly let one of the people that are part of our staff around the room know, and we'll do everything we can to keep you out of the photos and out of the video. To lead things off tonight with a few words, I'd like to introduce Mark Black with Terrebonne Parish Government. And he's going to talk a little bit about some of the local efforts that are underway here to make these communities more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I have to get my notes here. First of all, on behalf of Parish President Gardner, I'd like to welcome all of you to this kickoff meeting tonight, which is the first of several that will take place in Terrebonne Parish, particularly in our bayou communities. This meeting tonight is about resiliency. Big word, perhaps, but those are the things that we need to do as a parish to meet our environmental challenges and ensure our long-term survival here in Terrebonne. Now, we have all worked diligently to make Terrebonne a very resilient parish. But resiliency in Terrebonne is multifaceted. And our resiliency strategy is built on multiple lines of defense. I'm sure some of you have heard that expression before. Our first line of defense, of course, is our barrier islands. And next would be our coastal marshes, followed by Morganza to the Gulf, which is our massive hurricane protection, flood risk protection levee that is currently under construction. And I think we're just about finished with the first reach to 12 feet. It's going to go to 18. The next line of defense is our inland marshes, which are very important. These are fresh marshes for the most part, followed by our forced drainage levees around the parish, and there are many of those. And lastly, our last line of defense, believe it or not, is structured elevation. And if you look around the parish, I know you all know this, and perhaps many of you have already elevated your homes, Terrebonne leads Louisiana, if not the country, in elevations of structures to reduce flood risk. And I think with the help of FEMA, we're doing a pretty good job with that. However, no one of these components makes us resilient. But taken together, all of these components of our strategy make us much more resilient. They have to be taken together. The parish is constantly pushing and working to make each component of our resiliency strategy better and stronger. If you look to the rear of the room, there are two examples of our overall resiliency strategy. These are floodgate lock systems on Bayou Ukiah and Bayou Terrebonne. These are very important for us. They do need funding, and hopefully one day we'll get that funding to put in those two components. And although these particular elements are very important to our overall resiliency strategy, there are other ideas to promote resiliency that need to be considered as well. I think tonight we're going to be asked to discuss what resiliency means to you and how your ideas can be accomplished. And I think it's going to, I hope we have a little fun doing that. But before I give the microphone back to Matt, I want to recognize a few people in the audience. First of all, Mr. Steve Frostclair, who is a parish council member. Representing Chief Albert Nakan of the Biloxi Chickamauga Choctaw Tribe, Mr. Tommy Dardar. Representing the Home Terrebonne Regional Planning Commission, Mr. Alan Ostheimer. And representing our Coastal Zone Committee, which I work with a lot, Mr. Jerry Leday, Jerry, and Mr. Well, look, thanks all of you for attending tonight. I hope we all come out of here with something that is of value to us, and I think we will if we all put our heads together. Thank you very much. Matt?
want to thank Mark and everybody at Terrebonne Parish Consolidated Government for hosting us this evening and being a valuable partner to the state of Louisiana in all of our efforts to try to protect our coastline. To preface my conversation to kick off our event tonight, I mentioned that I work for the state's Office of Community Development. So we have a $16 billion disaster recovery portfolio spanning from Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isaac, the March flooding event statewide last year, and then most recently the August flooding event. When I first started working for the Office of Community Development several years ago, we had a mantra that we were in business to go out of business. The idea was we would recover from a large significant event like a Hurricane Katrina, and then we would all go off and get other jobs. Unfortunately, as we stand today, nobody talks about that anymore. And I think we've come to a stark realization that the disaster events that we face here in Louisiana are repetitive, they're severe, they're going to keep taking place. So all of those storm disaster events that I mentioned a moment ago happened within an 11-year period of time. And if we think about the next 11 years, and the 11 years after that, and so on and so forth, I don't think anyone has a realistic expectation that we're going to experience fewer events of less severity. We've also come to understand as a state that we've got this very toxic system in place, by which as our coastline erodes, and as the seas rise, and we experience subsidence, we're more susceptible to those disaster events. And so you've got two things working in concert. You've got ongoing environmental degradation, and you've got these severe disaster events that, in that 11-year period, have impacted every parish in the state of Louisiana. And so when we talk about adaptation, as we're going to talk about tonight, we're talking about those severe disaster events and our ability to recover, withstand those storms. But we're also talking about the larger overall environmental problem that Mark alluded to, and he pointed out some of the parishes' local implementations to protect communities and economic assets. But we're going to touch on a few basic themes throughout the evening. One is the idea that we have to be fully supportive of coastal restoration. We have to be fully supportive of structural flood protections. But we also have to understand that alone, those two things are not going to help us solve, in total, our coastal problem, and they're not going to fully protect us from those disaster events that I alluded to. And so we talk about this in terms of a three-legged stool. Like any other three-legged stool, if one of the legs doesn't exist, it gets chopped out. You can't sit on the stool. And so that's what we talk about relative to adaptation. If you look at the 2017 Coastal Master Plan, if the plan is fully implemented, fully funded, all of the projects take hold as we expect them all to take hold, the stark reality is that we're still going to lose land faster than we can rebuild it. And our lowest lying communities are going to experience a heightened sense of flood risk compared to those conditions today. And so if we know that everything we put into coastal restoration and everything we put into structural flood protection, while vital to the safety of our communities, we know that it can't fully protect us relative to a condition that we're under today, then we have to think about this adaptation concept. What are we going to do with the knowledge that restoration by itself can't solve the problem, and structural protection by itself can't solve the problem? So to help me do that today, I'd like to point out a few people around the room that are going to help with the presentation and some of the exercises that we're going to run through. From my shop, Mr. Dakota Fisher, you can raise your hand. If at some point you're trying to get my attention, and also from my shop. A few other folks that are going to speak to you today, our friend Liz Williams, the Foundation for Louisiana. The state has formed a partnership with the Foundation on this project. If you enjoyed the meal, she's the person to thank. This is also a fairly large project, and I'll talk about how we're trying to do this simultaneously across 6 parishes in a minute. But we've assigned our partner organizations to take the lead in particular parishes. And here in Terrebonne Parish, we've asked the Center for Planning Excellence to be our eyes and ears on the ground and really help us understand what's important to everyone here in this room and everyone in the parish. So when we develop a plan, we develop a vision around this adaptation concept, we do so with the smartest available information at hand. And from the Center for Planning Excellence, Camille Manning-Brute is going to say a few words tonight about Terrebonne Parish, and she should be the person that you all look to as we move forward in this process. So, to kick things off, we're talking about a program called Louisiana Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments, or SAFE for short. We talk about, clicker's not on. First of all, thank you for coming. I'll be right back to that. You can expect a couple of things from us tonight. So one, we're going to talk about that concept that we can't rebuild land faster than losing it. And no matter really what we do through the coastal master plan and through restoration and structural protection, we're all going to be under a higher flood risk in the future than we are today. We talk about that a little bit, but we're also going to talk about the opportunities we have around that reality. So a lot of what you're going to see tonight is a projection looking out 50 years. So that's basically 2 generations. So if we have a good understanding of what the condition is going to look like in 2 generations, then we can do things now to experience a better set of outcomes. So we're going to start off with, I guess, the doom and gloom portion of the show. We're going to talk about how we're modeling things out to the future, but it's all going to be wrapped around the idea that we have opportunity here to experience something better. Together, we form a relationship in the way that I know that we all will, and we all put our heads together and use our own creativity to develop a common vision for the parish, a common vision for the low-lying communities. We'll end up with an adaptation strategy at the end of the day that articulates that risk and articulates a common vision for how we move forward in spite of the risk. So, when we talk about this adaptation concept, it's not the type of term like a chair, right? Everybody knows what a chair is. When we talk about adaptation, it's much more broad. You ask 100 people what adaptation means, you're going to get 100 different answers. As a result of that, at no point tonight or throughout this process am I going to stand in front of a crowd like this and define what adaptation means. Because adaptation has to mean what it means for your community. And that has to embody what your community is, the values you all carry with you in that community. Because when we talk about a community under threat, we're talking about how we preserve the viability of the community. If we talk about what we're going to do to persevere over time, we have to understand what the lifeblood of that community is. There are a few ways to think about adaptation. We can talk about a response to environmental conditions, which is part of what we're talking about here. We can talk about the process of changing to fit a process of changing to a purpose. But what we're going to talk about is working together for community resilience, economic prosperity, and a better quality of life for all of Louisiana. And what we mean by that is, I mentioned all of those disaster events that my office works to help people recover from. Even as we talk about the coastal problem, it's really a state problem. We have cultural assets in our coastal communities. We have economic assets in our coastal communities that we simply can't abandon. And if we do, we're going to lose a piece of ourselves in the process. Part of what makes Louisiana Louisiana. Additionally, as we've seen transitions take place as a result of this ongoing environmental breakdown and those repetitive disaster events, those have lasting repercussions not only in our localized, low-lying parishes, not only in our parishes, but across the state. So, when we deal with population movements, when we talk about how individuals are reacting to the things that are happening in our environment, that's really got to come from the state level, because Unfortunately, over the past several years, we've seen a condition where the state has lost population, and they're moving to other places as a result of disaster events. And that affects our ability to be viable as a state. I think everybody knows the state of Louisiana is not a wealthy state. So the extent to which we can protect our assets, protect the tax base, those are all things that we need to do to continue to be the place that we've all grown up with. So this initiative is born out of something called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. A couple of years ago, HUD put $1 billion up for 67 states and cities to vie for. And the challenge was simple. How do you assess risk? And how do you develop ideas to protect your most vulnerable communities? The state of Louisiana ended up finishing 5th in that competition, and we were awarded $93 million. Part of that award is for a project that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that's the resettlement of Jean-Charles in southwestern Terrebonne Parish. The other $40 million was awarded to this project specifically, and it wasn't awarded to a project, but rather a concept. And it was around the idea that as we move forward, and as we incur a higher degree of risk, as we continue to lose land, we're going to experience a series of conditions by which some of our coastal communities are going to contract. They're going to get smaller. Fortunately, in some cases, we have communities that may not exist at all over 50 years. But we understand we have a working coast that we can't retreat from. Those cultural assets, those economic assets I talked about a minute ago, we have to preserve them. We have to strategically figure out what are the areas on the coast that we can't lose. We've got to make investments to support the protection of those areas. But finally, if we've got good modeling information, if we understand what future flood risk looks like, if we understand where we're going to lose land and where we can rebuild land, we also have the opportunity to identify those areas in which growth can take place. And so if we can identify those areas in which growth can take place, we have a responsibility to incentivize it from a population standpoint, from an economic standpoint. And that's really what this $40 million is about. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development asked us to go into the 6 parishes you see here and develop adaptation strategies, after which we will make investments in projects across the 6 parish region. Relative to the problem that we face, I think we all understand that $40 million is not a ton of money. But what we're really trying to do here is prove a concept. And we're trying to prove the idea that if we talk about what adaptation means, if we talk about the communities and we work with communities that are under threat, we can creatively put our heads together around a better set of ideas than maybe we've had in the past. And I think if we're able to do that, we'll be able to build that third leg of the 3-legged stool, that adaptation leg. And as we talk about future iterations of the Coastal Master Plan in 2022 and beyond, we're really being looked at to set a precedent here. To lay out a guide for which those funding decisions may be made in the future. So, we understand that planning is not a new concept, specifically after Katrina. Southeastern Louisiana especially has been subject to a lot of plan making. A lot of those plans are very good plans. A lot of plans have been made here locally. And so it's our challenge to say, if we understand all the local planning efforts that have taken place, if we understand all of the great scientific modeling that's in the Coastal Master Plan, how do we combine those things together? And how do we identify the value that we can add to what's already in existence? That's part of what we're doing here today. And so, when we get into the exercises, we're going to talk about some of the changes that have taken place. We're going to ask you to tell us what you've seen with your own eyes, what you've heard with your own ears. And then we're going to take all of the information that we can put our hands on, and hopefully at the end of the day, we'll make a gumbo that makes some sense. We're going to do this through a process we call co-design. And so, not to get overly in the weeds on planning terminology, what we're really talking about with co-design is how we create a relationship with you. with all of our local communities that are under threat, with the parish as a whole, across 6 parishes as a region. And there are a few things that we have to do if we're going to form a real relationship with you all. If we're all going to work together to develop an adaptation plan. And I think we've embodied those things in our co-design principles. So we have to share power, we have to prioritize relationships, we have to include all points of view, we have to use all kinds of knowledge. And so I'll just stop on that for a moment. I never cease to be amazed by the idea that we can have all of the best scientific modeling in the world, but I've learned more by going out on boats with people that have lived here their entire lives, and I can never learn from any scientist. Finally, test solutions early and often. So this is the beginning of a process that will ultimately finish up at the end of the year. And so what we're going to do is we're kicking off with this meeting here today. We're calling this a parish-wide meeting, and this is intended to begin a relationship with you all. But as we come to understand who you are and your communities and what's important, and we all start developing ideas that will eventually become this strategy, it is our responsibility to keep coming back to you over and over again around the idea that, we as professionals, we bring some expertise to the table. I'm never going to know your community the way you do. So I'm standing here with a microphone, but really all of you are the most important people in the room. And so if we're successful, we'll be able to create something of an information loop. Right? We're going to come down, we'll ask you questions, we'll gather information, we'll go back, we'll synthesize it in a way that we think makes sense, and then we're going to keep coming back and we're going to ask you, does this make sense? You need to tell us yes or no. No, it's not. If we're not doing something smart, we want to know that too. But at the end of the day, hopefully we'll have something we can all be proud of. We'll have a common vision for what this parish can be, what the low-lying communities can be, and how we all move forward toward realizing that future. And at the end of the day, if we have that strategy in hand, it'll be embodied by a series of pilot projects. And if those projects are successful, then we'll be able to take a series of ideas and replicate them and scale them across the state, across the country. So here we are, Parish-wide meeting 1. We'll come back in a few months and we'll spread out into the communities that really are the lifeblood of the parish, and you're going to tell us what those communities are and where we should go later on during this meeting. Then we'll come back as a big group. Again, we'll ask you, do we have this right? Does this make sense? Does this reflect your values? And we'll go back out into constituent communities and do this again. And then finally, when we come back for a third time as a larger group, we'll have something in draft plan. So we'll be able to say, here are the projects, here are the programs, here are the policy recommendations that you all talk about with us, and we all develop together. And even then, we'll ask you one more time, is this still right? So we've assembled a fairly large team, and this is unprecedented in the state of Louisiana, specifically how we brought the NGO and the philanthropic community on board with us. But again, for all of the expertise and intelligence and everything that you see on this board, none of it matters if we don't resonate with you all in some way, shape, or form. We don't create a relationship by which we understand what's happening here and what stands to change over time and develop some level of trust. And as somebody that works for the state, I understand how difficult that is. Then we're ultimately not going to be successful in this process. Because what we're talking about is the future of your community, the future of your parish. We know things are going to get more dangerous over time. If we know we're going to lose more land than we can rebuild, yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow. But let's all work together to figure out what we're going to do about it outside of those restoration activities, outside of the structural protection.
How y'all doing? Good. So I'm Liz Williams, and I'm with the Foundation for Louisiana. I specifically manage our Coastal Resilience Leverage Fund. The foundation was started 5 days after Katrina as the Louisiana Disaster Recovery Fund. And we've been working ever since then to pull in philanthropic resources from other places and be able to get those to communities on the ground. But what I want to talk to you here tonight is about our need to adapt and look back at the sort of history of Louisiana in order to look forward and be proactive about how we plan together. We're talking about here tonight the risks that we face because of continued land loss and the fact that land loss does worsen our existing risk levels. But I want to step back in time and go over exactly how we got here. What you're looking at here is the former distributary system of the Mississippi Delta. Obviously, many of you know these waterways well, but the Mississippi River used to change course and sort of shift across the Delta landscape, across an arc about 200 miles wide. And with that, there were spring flood events where we saw massive amounts of fresh water and sediment that would establish a new layer of land over that existing layer of land every single time it flooded, every spring event. So what changed? What we're looking at here in the Mississippi River Basin, right, is the draining of the entire country. The Mississippi River Basin drains 41% of the U.S., everything from the Appalachian Mountains all the way to the Rocky Mountains. All of that comes right here. And what used to happen was that was distributed across our wetland ecosystems. But right now what you're looking at in the purple is the flood extent of the flood of 1927. What we saw in that event was massive flooding, and so we made the decision as a country to levee off the river and prevent those flood events from destroying our communities and challenging our way of life, preventing economic growth in the way that we see it now. We levied off the river and we solved the problem of yearly flooding. But what we did with that was also solving the problem of yearly flooding. We stopped that inundation of fresh water and sediment from going out into our wetland ecosystems. So this turned to something like this, where we see the mud go out off the continental shelf through the Mississippi River Delta Basin, which is now just the Birdsfoot Delta, and through Wax Lake and the Atchafalaya Delta. We've now prevented that freshwater and sediment from going into our basins. We see in 2008, where we opened the Bonnie Carey Spillway, that sediment also went out into Lake Pontchartrain, but it also went out again over the Birdsfoot and into the Wax Lake Delta. We see this fresh water and mud go out into the waters, and it's sort of wasted. So the sediment is no longer able to build new land. We can't add another layer to the cake that we live on. So we see that land sink, and when the land sinks, we're able to see that the wetlands, or the species in the wetlands, lose the strength of their roots. We see saltwater enter. We see plants and marshes change. We see greater storm surge because that wetland buffer, that sort of protector that used to be outside of our communities, continues to disintegrate. And so with that comes this higher risk that we talk about. So our land is sinking at the same time as the sea level is rising. And so we see this condition worsened here in our delta. So what about inside the levees? Inside the levees, historically we used to see the river, and we would build up and elevate our communities. We would see that floodwater go underneath. And over time, we've constructed those levees to prevent that floodwater from the river and from our delta, from our bayous, from flooding our communities. And so we built closer to the ground. But with that, we were safe from the river floods, right? We had the levees, and so we were fine from those river floods. But over time, what we've seen is that the land has sunk also inside the levees as well as outside the levees. The land subsides. And so we see from a storm event that water can get closer and closer to our communities. And so again, that buffer is different. And most of our levees haven't been designed to actually incorporate the tidal fluxes and the daily energies. So we have to think holistically about the whole system. We have to think about all of these components so that we can plan together how Louisiana could adapt to these challenges. What you're looking at here is an elevation map of our coastal delta. And what you'll see is that all of the highest grounds are areas that used to be right next door to the former river and waterways.
So when we talk about the changes that have taken place over time relative to the environmental changes that have taken place, we understand that people have largely chosen to move to those areas that are those high elevation areas. So those areas where the river either currently runs or where it used to run. We're seeing fairly significant population declines in our most low-lying communities. Additionally, as we've seen populations retreat from these low-lying communities, we've also seen median incomes decline. So what does that tell us? It tells us, in general terms, the people with the economic means to make a choice, in many cases are making the choice to move away from our most vulnerable areas. And so those people that don't have those economic means, fortunately, are those people that remain in those communities and remain under threat. So that's a problem at all levels, specifically a problem that the state cares about. And part of what we want to talk about is what do we do about those communities and those households that don't have those same economic options than those folks that have moved on. I do think in general terms for us to talk about where we're going to go, we have to first take a look at where we've come from. So in 1960, we had this very nice, well-defined boot-shaped figure of Louisiana, the type of boot that you see on koozies and t-shirts, and is that cartoonish image of the state. There's one on many of our posters around the room. Today, we understand that the boot is by and large gone. It's now this skeletal-looking thing. If we don't do anything, the skeleton will even disappear. It's going to end up retreating to where a place like home, where we are today as a coastal city. If we implement the Coastal Master Plan, we can make a lot of progress. We can rebuild a lot of land, we can protect a lot of areas. You see a structure like Morgan's to the Gulf. And a lot of these are specifically designed to protect larger population centers. However, even if we fully implement the Coastal Master Plan, as I mentioned, we're going to incur a higher degree of flood risk. So today, our highest flood risk is along the east bank of the river in Platte Parish. If we don't do anything, you see a lot more of this deep blue along the entire coastline. And this, these are people, these are communities. They're going to be under heightened threat. If we do the Coastal Master Plan, which the state is committed to doing, we do see some of the protections come into place. You see where some of those coastal restoration activities help this flood situation. But if you compare where we're at today with our best case scenario under the Coastal Master Plan, you still see a lot more dark blue. And that means people are going to be under threat. To talk a little bit more about what we think that means here at the parish, and turn things over to Camille.
Great, thank you, Matt. Hi, Camille Manning-Broom, Center for Planning Excellence. We're going to talk a little bit about Terrebonne Parish specifically, and I'm honored to be working with Terrebonne Parish residents and leaders to help facilitate this adaptation strategy and plan for the parish. Over the past several months, we've been meeting with individuals and leaders, talking to you all about how things have changed over time and getting insight in how you want to move into the future. One person told us, the people who work on the water have a deep knowledge of the whole system through the years of living here. And we think this is a good place to start our discussion with you. From 1960, this map, and we'll look over the past 50 years, but people originally settled into this area because of its isolated geographic location, limited government control, fertile land, and the abundance of wildlife and fish. And that just shows how the land changed in this region. And specifically, let's look at the landmarks over the last 50 years in Terrebonne Parish. Here's the parish 50 years ago. The white area is the highlands, light gray are the marshes, and the dark gray is the water. And this is today. And I don't need to tell you this story because you know it better than anybody. You've experienced it, you've seen it with your own eyes. And here's the parish if we do nothing in 50 years from now. And that is why it's going to take all of us to work together to make solutions and make them happen. If we don't, CPRA estimates that Terrebonne Parish could lose 41% of its land by 2067, and Houma truly becomes a coastal city. However, there are multiple paths forward, and this parish has worked harder than many others in ensuring that we've got a flood control structures in place, a protection system. In addition, the master plan has the Morgans of the Gulf that will protect many communities. Mark Black talked about the resilience multiple lines of defense strategy that you guys have in place. And although even with those things in place, there still will be land loss. However, you can see with these green patches, there's also land gain. And how does this relate to flood risk? This is flood risk if a Category 3 hit this area, and these are the depths. You can see the dark blue at 15. This is 15 feet. That's today with no action, and that's why we can't let this happen. And here's with the master plan. This is why it's so critical for us to have this discussion today, because as Mark mentioned, not one defense system in itself will protect us all. We have to think about all the different components of the multiple lines of defense. How we make decisions on development, housing, infrastructure, how you're already elevating roads and critical infrastructure. How can we adapt over time to ensure that we can manage this water? Thanks to the Ivy Board of Realtors who are here, we conducted a poll in 2013. And this was across coastal Louisiana, but a lot of respondents were from Terrebonne Parish. And what we learned during that was that 1 in 4 know family who have left, and 4 in 10 have no friends or neighbors who have left. And in your words, when you relocate, it's like a death. It plays on your mental and physical well-being. And so how many people are feeling this pain right now? From 2000 to 2010, Terrebonne Parish had an increase in 7,400 people. However, as we can see on this map, the red dots dictate loss, population loss, and the green dots, population gain. What we see is people moving north, up the bayou, and they're moving on to higher land. The areas that they're relocating to equate exactly with where there's higher elevation, higher land that doesn't flood. And this also happens to be where the major job employers are. After the oil bust in the 1980s, your parish has worked really hard to diversify its economy. Although oil and gas is still its primary source, you've increased your other jobs like medical, transport, shipbuilding, tourism, and again, 20% of the Louisiana seafood comes out of Terrebonne Parish. Where are these people working? Where do these people live that are working here? We do see a trend. 50% of the people that work in Terrebonne do not live in Terrebonne. This has increased since 2004. It could increase in the future. However, a lot of people that live here also don't work here. And in your words, people who have lived here all of their life can't afford to live here anymore. We just can't live off the land like we used to. The overall trend suggests land loss and flood risk are increasing. People are moving up the bayou on higher elevation. And there's an increasing amount of people working in Terrebonne that don't live here. However, there's a strong sense of place and resilient people who want to live here. In your words, our kids are passionate about living here and being involved in contributing to the parish's future. So now we'd like to hear about your ideas so that together we can identify solutions and ensure that you and your children and grandchildren can continue to make Terrebonne your home and with a high quality of life. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to
Thanks, Camille. So when we talk about these increasing risks and with the challenges that we're facing to coastal land loss, both in the past and in the future, we're looking at 2 generations. We're looking at 2 generations previously and 2 generations in the future. How do we think about what could be the scenario in 2067 in order to be really innovative and creative here tonight? How do we think about what has already been happening in our community and what we've seen across our coastal parishes? We want to know here tonight, and I'm going to hand it over to our table hosts here in a second, how these changes have affected you. What you'll see on your table is a map that shows a zoom in of the parish. Would you somebody hit the light on it? Thank you. What you'll see on your table is a zoom in of your parish. The dark blues on that parish map are areas where we've already lost land. The areas of light blue are areas where we could lose land in the future. So you'll discuss with your table hosts and with your friends, your neighbors, your family, whoever you came here with tonight, how these changes have affected you, those environmental changes. We want you to think about not only the environment, but how we've seen changes to our population and how have you seen those changes in your community. We want you to talk about here tonight how you've seen economic change. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to our table hosts and thank you guys for your participation.